First of all, I want to thank the Festival Committee for putting together these evenings of talks. It's a great opportunity for us directors to say a little bit more about our plays, which is wonderful. And I'd like to thank St Mildred's for hosting this evening in this historic, fantastic church. And I also just want to say something about Tessa, because Tessa is just the most amazing member of my cast. She plays Worcester with a very convincing northern accent and very convincing northern attitude. Do come along and see her, because she is just terrific. I've got a terrific cast. I mean, Elliot's in it too. But no, I mean, she's marvellous. She's the first person to learn all her lines. She is really just holds the thing together, and we're delighted that she is feeling better and is up and about again. So thank you, Tessa. And yes, I'm going to be talking about modern parallels in Henry IV Part 1, because I'm setting it in modern times, which I'll explain in a minute. But first of all, why did I decide to direct Henry IV Part 1? Well, my first experience of the Canterbury Shakespeare Festival was the year before COVID. I think we'll be all saying that at some point in terms of dates rather than specific calendar dates. But the year before COVID, I was involved. On a whim, I auditioned and I got a part in The Merry Wives of Windsor. And of course, The Merry Wives of Windsor is the play that Shakespeare wrote for Falstaff, because he was such a popular character that he had created that the public were clamouring, we want more Falstaff. He'd been killed off in the Henry plays, so what are we going to do? Well, let's just write a comedy for him. And it was great fun being involved. We had a wonderful Falstaff, and we have a wonderful Falstaff in Henry IV Part 1 this year, because this is the play that introduced him. It also happens to be the first Shakespeare play that I properly studied for O-level. I think there are enough people in this room who probably did O-levels rather than GCSEs back in the day. And interestingly, my husband found this out, it's the one that's been most consistently in print since Shakespeare's time. So it's obviously a very popular play. I know it's studied a lot and performed quite regularly. And I think that's probably partly to do with Falstaff, but also the other things that go on in the play. Henry IV Part 1 has a Canterbury connection. Both parts of Henry IV are buried in the Canterbury Cathedral. He's the only king who's buried there. And also, of course, Falstaff and his friends carry out a robbery of Canterbury pilgrims at Gad's Hill, so not so far away. So we've got that link. Henry IV was the first English king since the Norman Conquest to be a native English speaker, which is interesting to think about. So perhaps it's fitting that there are so many modern issues that Shakespeare seems to be addressing in his play. And I think this follows on quite well from the Aros talk, which I have no preview of, but there are points of contact that you'll see as I'm talking. So I think that's what intrigued me most, were all the things, the modern parallels, and it encouraged me to set the play in today's Britain. Now, setting Shakespeare's been set in so many places, so many times, and sometimes it can be a little bit gimmicky. It can be done just for effect, just to get people in, well, we'll set it in such a place for such a time. So I was a little bit nervous about this, but the parallels just piled up, and I thought, I can't resist this. When I first pitched the idea to the committee, it was post-Brexit, and that was part of my inspiration as Liara. And particularly as well, there were the issues of the Scottish referendum and independence and all of that going on, and so it seemed to me appropriate. But there was other things that had happened that still speak through the play, I think. It was before the war in Ukraine. It was before the specific issues we've got at the moment surrounding the Northern Ireland Protocol. It was before the steep economic decline following COVID, and before the general scepticism about levelling up following the cracks in the Red Wall. But all these contemporary issues do seem to be reflected in the play. Before I talk about modern parallels, I hope to be bringing out my production. It's worth thinking about why a play set in the 1400s interesting to Shakespeare's audience. We know all of his history plays were the most popular of his plays at the time, especially in the Sixth Trilogy, and not just because they helped to consolidate the Tudor myth of the rightful claim to the throne of Elizabeth and her ancestors, but also because, of course, they explored the political and social preoccupations of Shakespeare's time, of the late 1500s. Political allegiance, foreign affairs, national threats, opportunities. With an aging queen on the throne and succession unsure, as well as the ever-present fear of Catholic resurgence, Shakespeare creates in Henry IV an atmosphere of uncertainty and insecurity, even though he's setting it nearly 200 years before he's writing it. Of course, he was quite prepared to tweak history to suit his dramatic purpose, as he does, for example, by making Prince Hal, and Hotspur contemporaries. In history, Hotspur was considerably older than Hal, and they wouldn't have met at the Battle of Shrewsbury the way that they do at the end of the play, but dramatically it works very well to have two Harrys of the same age, one rising, one falling. And of course he introduced this marvellous anti-father figure of Falstaff. But if the play holds up mirrors to Shakespeare's time, it certainly does to ours too. The date of the Battle of Shrewsbury at the end of the play is 1403, but it could be 2022. England's leader is trying to distract from domestic problems by focusing on a foreign war. New broils to be commenced on Strong's remote, he refers to in the opening speech of the play. Yes, I can tell from your reaction, I don't really have to explain that any further. But his own people want to hold him to account. The northern leaders who helped him into the throne, helped him get into power, feel betrayed. The promises have been broken, and their interests are not being addressed. He forgot his oath to them at Doncaster in one of the lines, and he knows when to promise but not when to pay is another line. It was interesting, I watched a little Parliament TV this week, as I'm sure other people have been. But earlier in this week, before the interesting developments, a Labour MP from Northumberland, and of course we have Northumberland in the play, as Hotspur's dad, a Labour MP from Northumberland talked of the betrayal of my constituents. And another Labour MP said that the PM's promises exist only in his imagination. Moreover, what else is going on in the play? Well, the union, and it wasn't really a union at the time, but it is now, is under threat, with defiant Scottish and Welsh leaders who don't want to be under the control of the government in Westminster. Again, I heard somebody from Plaid Cymru talk about the current government being, the former, well, he's not really, the Prime Minister, Boris, being the best recruitment sergeant for independence. That was a quote from this week, not from Shakespeare. Of course, the parallels are not exact. You can't force them too much. The leader in London in the play, in Westminster, isn't a democratically elected Prime Minister, he's king. But of course, the word connection leads to another interesting point of contact between the play and modern times. The king is having to deal with his oldest son, Prince Harry, who is shirking his royal duties. He's getting a bad name for himself, hanging out with the amoral and self-indulgent nobleman Falstaff, whose primary interests are drinking, womanizing, and making money by whatever means possible, including petty crime. Falstaff says, "'Tis no crime for a man to labour in his vocation," when he's talking about stealing money. And he's very good at using other people's credit to get where he is. So, those parallels are very clear, I think. And throughout the play, characters define themselves in relation to concepts of honour, honesty, and loyalty. So Hotspur's speech says, "It were an easy leap to pluck bright honour from the pale-faced moon." and some of the characters emerge with far more integrity than others. I have a fantastic group of actors who are bringing Shakespeare's text to life while channeling, among others, Boris, Nigel Farage, Jess Phillips, Andy Burnham, Nicola Sturgeon. You'll hear echoes of all of them, I think, in the play, and their attitudes and their accents and their marvellous acting really brings it out. They also take on ensemble roles as TV reporters, members of the press, to add an extra dimension to the play and make it feel more modern in some ways. So far I've been kind of focusing on the political parallels with modern times, and as I say, I think there are many. But there are other ways that Henry IV, Part 1, reflects concerns that we have too. The tension between generations is dealt with, as in other Shakespeare plays, with Hal torn between two very contrasting father figures, the king and Falstaff. And Hotspur, equally, is kind of vacillating between respect for and frustration with the older generation, including the larger-than-life Owen Glendower. To what extent they can follow their own path, where their responsibilities lie, and to what extent public opinion impinges upon their sense of self, all questions that I know we ask ourselves and are particularly those in the spotlight are asking themselves. Personal as well as private life, the public life rather, is open to scrutiny and played out under the spotlight of popular interest. So what are the challenges of a modern setting? It's one thing to put the cast in modern dress, have them hold mobile phones and speak into microphones, but it's quite another to deal with the language of the play that is clearly historical. I wanted to retain Shakespeare's text, including references to battles, etc. I edited it, so the play is not its full length, but I have remained true to Shakespeare's words, almost exclusively. So what I'm doing is I'm encouraging my actors and I hope my audiences to think of these references as metaphors. So the Battle of Shrewsbury at the end of Act 5 becomes a general election. And death is by social media and exit polls rather than by swords. The travellers who are robbed in Act 2 are tourists rather than pilgrims heading to Canterbury. And I also wanted to make sure that the political aspects are held in balance with the other strengths and joys of the play. I didn't want the politics entirely to take over. The character development of the prince is very important. He restores his reputation while Hotspur falls from grace. We have this shift from one young man to the other. Of course, there's a lot of verbal comedy and physical comedy involving Falstaff. We've been discussing with the committee whether we're going to have to do a trigger warning about fat jokes and fat shaming, because there's an awful lot of that goes on in the play. But there is also some marvellous poetry and poetic motifs that run right through the play. I thought I knew the play really well, but working on it with my actors, hearing them deliver their speeches, and having a slightly more edited version of the play where speeches come more closely to each other, has really made me understand just how much Shakespeare develops these poetic motifs that run right the way through the play. There's a lot of reference to the sun, the moon, to comets, to the heavens being on fire, lots of astrological imagery, and whether characters associate themselves with the moon or the sun becomes very important. And of course there is the pun on the word sun when Prince Hal is talking about being like the sun, because he's got to become a better son to his father. So I'm not going to speak for much longer. I just wanted to end by saying perhaps the greatest parallel, which I haven't addressed, is the lack of resolution at the end of the play. It's important to remember that Henry IV Part 1 is the second of 4 history plays, so nothing is going to be resolved at the end, and any victory we see is far from conclusive. The political struggles in this play lead to a lot of waste and suffering on the part of ordinary people, as well as the leaders. Times remain turbulent, and the power that is gained is very short-lived. In the final play of this particular history series by Shakespeare, Henry V, after the glorious victory at Agincourt, we're reminded, we come down to earth with a bump, because we're reminded right at the end of the play that everything that's been gained is going to be lost again, in very short order. Begging the question, was the fighting and the loss worth it? So, times may have changed since the 1400s when the play is set, and the late 1500s when it was written, but there remains, I would argue, a need to hold our leaders to account. Leaders who may, in Falstaff's word, consider honour a mere scutcheon, and ordinary people, either literally or metaphorically, food for powder, while they enjoy their fleeting moments of power and glory.